So welcome to this video on camera basics. In this video, we're going to look at aperture, which is also f-stop, and we're going to look at it real quickly, what it is, and then we're going to look at how it works in relationship to our creative image composition. So let's go ahead and start. The first thing you need to understand about aperture is that the way that you come up with the number for your aperture is really a complicated mathematical thing. You don't really need to bother with understanding all the math behind it. The apertures range from, in some cases, 1.2 or 1.1 up to 22 or 36, whatever. They go in a range. The larger the number, the less light that is going to be allowed into the sensor. The smaller the number, 1.4, as compared to f8, f1.4 lets in more light. So the smaller the number, the more light that comes in. And that's because technically it's a ratio, and as the number gets larger, the ratio of light coming in to light reaching goes down. So that's why the larger makes it go down. So it's inversely related. The second thing you need to understand is that f-stop number also affects something called depth of field. And this is another mathematically complicated calculation. Depth of field, by definition, is how much of what is out in front of the lens, how much of that is in focus. Sometimes you want a very narrow or shallow depth of field, and other times you want a lot of things to be in focus, which would be a deep depth of field, and so you can use aperture to create that. The other thing about depth of field, not only is it related to f-stop, it's related to the distance from the lens to the object. So the further something away is, the larger the depth of field. So you can think of it this way. When you set your camera aperture, a percentage of the distance to the object is going to be in focus. Some a little behind where it's focused, some a little in front. And the further away it is, that because it's a percentage of that distance, the further away it is, the more. Okay, how about let's just look at some examples. All right. So I've set my DSLR up on a tripod, and I have placed the meter stick in front of the lens. And I've set my f-stop to the absolute lowest on my camera, or the maximum amount of light that's coming in is 1.4, and that's going to give a really shallow depth of field. In this first picture, I have the aperture set at 1.4, and I have it at its closest focal point. And now I'm going to move my focus towards the end of the meter stick, and I'll take a picture of that. All right, so in these two images, both of these images are set at aperture 1.4, and you can see that it is very small portions of the meter stick are in focus. In the second image, however, you can tell that down at the end of the meter stick there is more than just one number in focus. If you look at the close side, the closest, you're going to see really only that 3 is in focus. So now I'm going to set the camera, I'm going to set the aperture to a much larger number, which is 22 on this camera. I'm going to re-bring the focus to the minimum point, which is about right here, and I'm going to take this picture. And I'm going to move the focus to the far end, and you'll see that more of the stick is in focus again as I move the focal point farther away. So the amount that is in focus is a function of the f-stop and the distance from the iris, technically, the lens, whatever, the distance from here to where the focus is set. Okay, now that is looking at the two different extreme apertures. If I go back even further, so if I set the camera up to shoot this row of chairs, then the amount of that's going to be in focus is going to vary. Because it's further away than 1 meter, much more is going to be in focus. So this first image will be at 1.4. And then the next picture, I'm going to put the aperture back at 22, and I'm going to shoot to the exact same focus. So you can see how the aperture affects the depth of field. So in these images, you can see how that aperture affects depth of field. Now, how do you use depth of field creatively in pictures? So I'm going to pull some pictures from my Instagram, and you can see how the depth of field affects the composition, the feel, the artistic expression in the picture, in very particular ways. So I created in my Instagram, I created a collection called Depth of Field. I put 6 pictures in it, and I just want to kind of go through these, kind of talk a little bit about the composition and how depth of field, which is a function of f-stop, how depth of field affects the composition. So the first is a picture similar to the one we took, and you can see in this picture, you can see that the chairs and the tables closest to the camera in focus, the further away you go, the blur begins to kick in. Now this is not a particularly shallow depth of field, but it illustrates how the focus will fall off as distance goes on. So this is the second picture here is a plate from Huey's, which is highly recommended. It's Huey's Burger. You can see that the first plate is in focus, and then in the distance you can see another sandwich which is not in focus. So the depth of field was deep enough to pick up pretty much all of the first plate, and then by the time you get to the ketchup cup over on the side, on the right side there, by the time you get to the ketchup cup, the depth of field has ceased to keep things in focus. It exceeds the depth of field, so it is out of focus, and then the plate further in the back is even more out of focus. In this image, this is a portrait of a young man, and obviously in a portrait we want the emphasis to be on the person. So the focus is somewhere on his face, and the things in the background fall off and go out of focus. So it makes us concentrate on the subject. Likewise, in this image where we have the young lady, some of the bricks are in focus in front of her. The focus is on her and her face. Beyond her, things begin to fall out of focus. So the depth of field was sufficient to pick up a little bit in front of the subject and up to the subject and probably a little bit behind the subject. And then beyond that, it was all out of focus, and you can see that. What you have is the chocolates on a plate. You can actually see that the thing in the foreground, the rim of the platter, is out of focus. The first of the chocolates is in focus and very delicious. And the further you go on the tray, although the chocolates are probably still very delicious, the focus falls off because the depth of field is very shallow, really only capturing about just a little more than one of the chocolate squares. And then lastly, what depth of field conversation would be complete without a train picture? So you can see obviously that in the distance, the depth of field falls off. The depth of field clearly focuses on the beginning of the train, and then far in the distance, it's out of focus again. So that's how depth of field can work, and you can use it very creatively. A lot of times in portraits, you want the subject to be in focus, you want your background to be out of focus. And you can achieve that blurred background by using a shallow depth of field, which is achieved by using the smallest f-stop. So the further you are from the subject, the more things are going to be in focus. The larger the aperture, the more things are going to be in focus. You can use this to create all kinds of creativity things. In a video that's forthcoming, we'll do camera settings and how you can set your camera and tell the camera what aperture to use in a half auto mode. So we'll look at camera settings in general later on. For now, this is enough on aperture and f-stop. So thing to remember, the smaller the number, the more light that comes in. The smaller the number, the more shallow the depth of field. The larger the number, the less light that comes in, and the larger the number, the deeper the depth of field. So if you just remember those two things about aperture, you have now the potential to be far more creative in your photography. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone else, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode.